If I can get us all to convene towards the middle. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for being here. For those who I don't know, I'm Sandro Galea. I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the School of Public Health at Boston University. And this is one of our regular Dean's seminars on contemporary issues in public health. And today we have an issue that's been very much of contemporary concern over the past several years, with a lot of highs and a lot of lows as we as a society have been dealing with this issue. From a public health point of view, I have written quite a bit, and this school is very much founded on the notion of public health built on a foundation of social justice, which makes this issue, I think, particularly salient as a flashpoint in our day. So I'm very excited today to have Mason here joining us. Dean Harold Cox, who is over here, has been the intellectual leader behind this series. I'm going to let Harold take it away. Harold.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Welcome to all of you to another one of our conversations about contemporary issues in public health. I'm very proud to introduce to you our guest today, Mason Dunn. Mason is trained as an attorney and has worked in the past for the New Hampshire ACLU and is currently serving as the CEO of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Caucus Coalition. And we're going to have a conversation today about transgender issues. We're going to talk about, so who are we talking about? We want to talk some about what are the political issues that we have been hearing so much about and that we are experiencing in our own community and state. And then kind of think about what are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about as public health professionals as we think about this particular population. So welcome very much.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm very excited.
I'm very glad that you're here. You know, one of the things that you mentioned to me when we were talking on the phone and getting to know each other is that this is a conversation that could easily take many hours. Lots to say.
Oh, yes, yes. And it's not just me that has lots to say about it, although
well, it could be.
I have a tendency to go on and on.
Yeah.
But absolutely, this is a conversation that I have the honor of also, I teach at UNH Manchester, and we have an entire semester dedicated to talking about these issues. And so it's a conversation that can take semesters. It can take years of study because there's so much to get into, so much nuance, history, health and wellness, political implications, religious implications. There's so much that we could go on about when it comes to gender identity and diversity of gender identity.
And we're going to do it all in 1 hour.
Sure. Okay. I'll talk fast.
Okay. So maybe the place to start our conversation is just with some primer. So it's I think important for us to understand how to use language, because language is clearly one way of expressing who we are and one way of identifying. Could you talk a little bit about what is the appropriate way to address the population that we're interested in today?
Sure. And one of the beautiful things about language is the way it evolves and changes. And so where we're at today is not where we were 10 years ago, and It's certainly not where we're going to be 10 years from now. But where we are at this moment, we oftentimes use the word transgender or trans as an umbrella term to discuss those who know their gender identity to be different than what they have been assigned at birth. And so we don't quantify this by saying, it's somebody who transitions or has medical care or identifies with one sex versus the other, because there's far more nuance to gender than the binary thinking of this or that. And so transgender, we say, is those who know their gender identity to be different than the one that they were assigned at birth. The sex that's listed on your birth certificate, for instance. And there's many different identities under the trans umbrella. Most people understand or have an awareness for the very binary gender identities, trans masculine or trans men, and trans feminine or trans women. People who transition from male to female or female to male, or identify as a man or identify as a woman. And those are the very binary understandings of gender identity under the trans umbrella. But there's actually a much larger sub-umbrella of the trans community that we talk about as non-binary identities. People whose gender identity is outside the binary of man or woman, male or female. What's helpful to understand is that one of the ways we oftentimes talk about this when we do a large Trans 101 that usually takes an hour and a half to 2 hours is that it's important to understand that the opposite of being a man isn't being a woman. The opposite of being a man is simply not being a man. And the opposite of being a woman, likewise, is not being a man, but the opposite of being a woman is simply not being a woman. And so non-binary identities push us out of that binary concept of either or to say, I am both, I am neither, I am beyond, I am a third. I am a third gender or a third identity outside of that. My gender is unique to me outside of that binary. And so that is one of the topics that we spend a lot of time having conversations about, that it's important to break away from binary thinking in terms of the trans community and understand the full nuance and complexity of this very large and diverse community.
So when we begin to think then around this third grouping and this third category of individuals, there's something when individuals begin to identify themselves as not being not feeling like they are the person that they are assigned to biologically. Could you talk a little bit more about that and kind of when that begins to happen for individuals, and if there's a set pattern for individuals or what the general experience is? And I suspect, and I know I'm already wrong by saying the general experience.
Yeah,
because there is no general experience.
My initial response is no.
Yeah.
It's.
I get corrected around here all the time.
Great.
So, okay.
Well, I'll jump into that trend now. It's that is a misconception that you know at this age, or that people should know by this age, or whatever it may be. But there's actually a even smaller nuance of the language we use to discuss trans identities that I want to point out. It's not a sense of feeling like a man, or feeling like a woman, or feeling like a non-binary gender. It is about knowing. It is this inherent knowing of, this is who I know myself to be, and I need to put that out there into the world of, I know you see me in one particular way, but you are wrong because I know myself to be a gender that you don't see or that you don't understand. And so there's that element of knowing versus feeling. It's subtle, but it's so important. On top of that, you know, the path or the journey for trans folks, it is impossible to say, well, a trans person at this age does this, and a trans person at that age does this. That is impossible, because that's impossible for all of human experience. It's impossible for us to tokenize one particular experience for any human being and say that this applies to all people. And so for many, in terms of gender identity, some people know at age 3 and come out at age 3. I work with many, many trans youth who are 5 and under, who their first full sentence was, "Mommy, I'm a boy," or "Daddy, I'm a girl," or, you know, articulating, "This is who I know myself to be," regardless of what you say. There are those who spend more time figuring it out. There are some for whom identity, and not just gender identity, but identity broadly, is fluid and changes over time. And the way that we experience the world around us may be a little bit more fluid than, "I am this and I will always be this." And that pertains to gender identity as well. My gender identity may be more fluid and may shift or change or adapt over time.
And so recognizing that this is a very complicated conversation, and that there are many pieces of this and many nuances, could you also add one more layer of complexity to it as we talk about the differences between sexual orientation and gender identity?
Absolutely. We talk about the LGBT or the LGBTQ or the LGBTQIA, and I can keep adding letters here, but we talk about this community as if it's a monolith, that we're talking about LGBTQ rights or LGBTQ identities. And oftentimes that unfortunately conflates gender identity and sexual orientation as if they're the same. Sexual orientation is about typical words we use to describe that of, you know, straight or gay, lesbian, bisexual. We can branch out into even more terms that are coming out or being utilized today, like pansexual, asexual, aromantic. All of these words describe sexual orientations, which means your relationship to somebody else, or your desired relationship with somebody else, or your not so desired relationship with somebody else. But it is about relationships for sexual orientation. Gender identity, on the other hand, is about who you know yourself to be. It is much more introspective and much more personal to say that this is my gender identity, this is who I am. That doesn't have any implication necessarily on your relationship or your sexual orientation, but it is a matter of who you are and who you know yourself to be versus your relationship with others.
So irrespective of whether we're talking about sexual orientation or gender identity, we understand this is a very complex kind of issue.
Absolutely.
And that we could spend a lot of time trying to understand the particulars and the nuances there. But I want to move to just the area of challenges and the challenges of individuals who identify as being trans. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. There are many instances where I receive emails or phone calls where people say, what is the #1 issue facing the trans community? And it's not so simple as that. I feel like the rest of my answers are just going to be, it's complicated, because it is. What is true as a major issue for one trans person is going to be very different for another trans person from different intersecting identities, communities, geography, age, race, language, immigration status. All of these things are going to have very different issues that rise to the top as the most problematic or the most in need of public policy. And so I can't even begin to say, what is the #1 issue. What I can say is that the trans-specific issues that we most hear about in public policy are around non-discrimination and protections, as well as health and access to health care for trans individuals, which I raise here because we talk a lot about health in this space. But I would say non-discrimination and health, as well as really important to understand that when we talk about policy and law and legislation or litigation, that is all very separate from true lived equality and lived experiences for trans people. We may have a law on the books, we may have legal protections. That doesn't mean that the lived equality and the lived experiences of trans people are at a place that is truly equal or equitable in our society. And so all of this to say, it's complicated, and it is something that we have to understand broadly of legal equality versus lived equality.
We're going to move a little more to talk about policy, but I want to stay a little more with this issue of talking about challenges and talking about the challenges to not only to the person, him or herself, but to themselves.
Getting into the non-binary world, it's complicated. But not everybody is him or her. Some people may be they, them, theirs, or ze, here, heres, and talking about some of the non-binary pronouns in our language.
So then that raises the issue then about what people want to be called.
Yes.
And who gets to decide what someone wants to be called. Yeah, but I want to talk a little bit about families.
Yes.
Because indeed, one of the challenges that individuals have is how they come out to their families and the kind of challenges that families have as they are dealing with the particular circumstance of their family member.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit more about your experience of what you experience with families?
Sure. And families are just as diverse and complex as trans identities and all of human experience. There are so many trans people who come out and have truly welcoming experiences, particularly with their immediate family, where I talked to a number of trans folks who say, I came out and my parents said, oh, I always knew this. Thank you for telling me, but I already knew.
Parents do tend to know these things already, don't they?
Right.
Yeah.
So, well, some do. Some may not, and some may struggle with it.
Sure.
And some may struggle in ways that are loving and working to get there. Some may struggle in ways that will never get there in a place of acceptance and welcoming for their child or their family member who may be trans. And so, for those who do experience discrimination within their own family units, may experience higher rates of health concerns, access to health care, higher rates of homelessness, higher rates of crime victimization, and all of these things that relate to how one experiences society when you've already been kicked out or experienced discrimination from your family. So
would you be willing to share with us a little bit about your own personal story?
Absolutely. And it's funny because when I do Trans 101s, I don't usually talk about my own experiences, but this isn't a Trans 101, so I can go there. But for me, I've had a kind of a mixed bag of acceptance in my own family. I came out as trans, particularly as genderqueer, which means that my gender identity was beyond man or woman, male or female, when I was about 19 years old. And I still do identify somewhat as genderqueer, having been assigned female at birth, but not really identifying 100% as a man or male. but I came out at 19 at the same year that my now spouse and I got engaged. And I was very open with her about this is who I am, this is an important part of my identity and my journey, and something that I bring to the table not as baggage, but as I want you to see me. And she 100% got it and was so loving and welcoming and said, you know, I'm on this journey with you, and if this is where your gender journey is, if that changes over time, that's all okay. I'm in this for the long haul. And so that was really an important aspect of welcome in my family. My parents, my dad and my stepmom are they are so progressive and so wonderful and really get it, and so are very compassionate, but also still struggle at times with things like pronouns and names, and that's okay. They are still also on a journey of learning and acceptance and what this means. When I was 25, I decided that a medical aspect for my own transition, which for me meant hormones and top surgery, that's where I needed to be at that time, and so I also changed my name at that time. And my family, my spouse, my parents, as well as my in-laws, I can't forget them. They are amazing, wonderful people who are so loving around this. Everybody said, yeah, okay, we're behind you on this. And so I was very lucky in that respect. But I do have members of my family who refuse to use appropriate pronouns. I use he, him, his pronouns, and don't want to do that and choose not to do that to see me in that way. Don't use my name, that I changed my name when I was 25. They don't use that now. And it's a struggle to work with people who, and to love people, because I still very much love them, but who don't love who I am. They love something that I am not, and don't see me for that. And so it is that kind of mixed bag of different responses and experiences. But as a funny aside, my father-in-law is an attorney as well, and he works in probate and estate. So he's a very numbers-driven, very detail-oriented person. And when I came to him and said, you know, I'm going to be transitioning. And so, you know, Lauren, my spouse, and I were still staying together. She supports me in this. And he thought for a moment, and he said, your taxes are going to be so much easier now. Indeed they are. And that was one of those moments of just loving acceptance. Like, I'm not even going to blink an eye at you know, accepting you, but I am going to think about the real life implications of tax law. So, you know, it has been a really fun journey in many ways with people who love and accept me.
So I am very glad that your journey has certainly been, as, I'm not going to say easy, but certainly
positive.
That you've had a positive experience,
Yeah.
certainly very different than some others.
Absolutely.
And as we then kind of talk about the issues of challenges of individuals who are transitioning, who are accepting a new way of thinking about themselves, the issue of how you get identification for your organization. Could you talk a little bit about just kind of what it even means, just the kind of the nuts and bolts of thinking about that?
So one of the challenges for people who do transition and want to change things like a name and gender marker, you know, if you take out your wallet and you look at all of the pieces of identification that have your name as well as a gender marker, and then think of all the other identity documents that are out there in the world with your name and either a pronoun or a gender marker on them. For trans folks who do transition, that access to something that reflects who you are is a bureaucratic process that takes years for some people. Changing your name in probate court, then going to Social Security and changing your name and the gender marker listed in the Social Security Administration to reflect your identity, then going to the RMV or DMV, depending on what state you're in, and changing your name and gender marker on your license or state ID, then going to the federal administration and changing your name and gender marker on a passport, then going to possibly immigration services and changing your name and gender marker on immigration documentation. If you're a veteran, changing your name and gender marker on veteran identification, then getting even further out and thinking about leases and mortgages, wills and estates, anything that has your name and a pronoun, for a trans person having to go through all of that rigmarole of changing all of that information, it's easy to see. It could take years. And there are some states as well as some federal agencies that really struggle with this and don't necessarily provide access to changing your name and gender marker on some of these pieces. And so that kind of navigation and process and cost, you can't discount the actual cost of changing your name and gender marker across all of these areas, or hiring a lawyer to help you change your name and gender marker across all these areas, is a major factor that trans people face every day. And luckily, with the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition, we do have a project to assist people, both financially and with pro bono lawyers with that process. But that's Massachusetts specific. Not every state has that. Not every state has a trans organization who can do that or has the capacity to do that. And that's just one small challenge relating to a piece of plastic in your back pocket. We can talk about all of the other areas where trans folks are experiencing discrimination in housing, in employment, in access to health care, in all of these other areas of our lives. That is just one small example.
So when we started talking about this session a while ago, one of the things we said was that this was a lot more than just talking about bathrooms.
Yes.
Because indeed that's where we spend most of our time talking about it. But it is important for us to talk about that, given that that's the conversation that everyone's having. So
Exactly.
let's talk about it.
Sure.
So what's the deal?
It's always a matter of when are bathrooms going to be brought up if I'm on a stage or talking to a group of people. And
All right, so
that's
it's brought up now.
We're there.
Yeah,
That's okay.
I have been watching the clock, and I
That's
knew
okay.
I needed to get there. So here we are.
So yeah, and you know, I understand that this is where the national conversation is and where the national policy seems to be developing. So there are attempts in many states, as well as in some federal instances, where trans people accessing restrooms that are consistent with our gender identities is, for some reason, a major issue. Let me just say this. Trans people are in your communities, are in your places of employment, your schools, your businesses, whatever it may be, and we use the bathroom just like everyone else. And for many of us, we use a restroom that is consistent with our gender identity without any issues. It is when people take issue with it, either through law, policy, or confrontation in a day-to-day scenario, where that suddenly becomes an issue. There is this assumption that by allowing trans people to utilize sex-segregated facilities that are consistent with our gender identities, somehow that will open up the floodgates and allow all people to utilize these spaces for nefarious or criminal elements. What we have seen in the national landscape, we've passed trans non-discrimination protections for all spaces, including restrooms, in 18 states. And in those 18 states, we have not seen an increase in calls for police interaction or public safety concerns. There has been no increase in criminality in public accommodations, including bathrooms.
Because that's been the big fear?
That's been the big fear. And it is a total misconception and myth that this is somehow going to cause people to be victimized in sex-segregated spaces. The numbers aren't there. The facts aren't there. The situations aren't there.
So in Massachusetts, we passed last year the anti-discrimination bill looking at public accommodations.
Right.
What exactly was that?
So it unfortunately got the misnomer of the bathroom bill. But what we were talking about...
But it got that because of what was happening in North Carolina?
No, actually, that started here. The bathroom bill argument, I believe it started here. It may have started somewhere else, but we were one of the first states where we got labeled the bathroom bill back in 2007. And so it just unfortunately stuck with us every time we tried to pass legislation. So it stuck with us when we talked about public accommodations. So although it was labeled the bathroom bill, actually public accommodations and the non-discrimination protections that we passed here in Massachusetts relate to all public spaces. And so the law before we passed this said that you could discriminate against somebody on the basis of their gender identity or gender expression in any public space, such as public transportation, such as parks, hospitals, hotels, restaurants, any space open to the public. Discrimination was allowed before this law. And so what we passed said that you cannot...
Which means that you could remove an individual from one of those locations.
You could remove an individual, but it actually gets even more complicated than that. If that, for instance, we had one instance where a trans woman was checking out at a grocery store. and was paying with a credit card, and the cashier said, I need to see extra forms of ID. And I need to see this form of ID. And I need to see that form of ID. Trying to find a mismatch of a gender marker with the identity presented that day. That also is an issue of discrimination. It's not as blatant and obvious as being kicked out, but it is still an issue of discrimination. And so prior to this law, that kind of discrimination was allowed, and there was no legal recourse for us to say, you can't do this. Now, with the law that was signed into law July 8th and went into effect October 1st, 2016, says that you cannot discriminate against somebody in any public space on the basis of their gender identity or gender expression. You cannot kick us out simply because of our gender identity. You cannot deny us service because of our gender identity. You cannot force us to show extra forms of ID. And you cannot kick us out of sex-segregated spaces that are consistent with our gender identity in any of these public spaces.
How complicated was it to move that piece of legislation?
More complicated than I ever thought it would be, because
you could teach a lesson for us here.
I could.
Yeah.
Well, what happened in Massachusetts actually was only done in Massachusetts. So in 2011, we passed non-discrimination protections in employment, housing, credit and lending, and education. They stripped out public accommodations from that bill, which was originally a part of that bill in 2011. Passed in 2011 without the public accommodations piece. It's the only state to have stripped out public accommodations. Only state. Because of bathrooms. Because people saw the word public accommodations and said, that must mean bathrooms. They didn't read the law, and so didn't understand that they were talking about all public spaces, despite us articulating the problem with removing public accommodations. And so what was passed was an incomplete non-discrimination protection compared to all of the other states who had passed it and have passed it since. So we are the only state who have then had to come back for public accommodations and pass it as a standalone piece of legislation. And that was a major concern and what held us back for a few years. But we were successful last year because of so many reasons, because of where the national dialogue was, the visibility for trans identities, as well as the huge amount of support that we got from so many different places that we hadn't seen before. We had over 250 businesses who signed on and said, we support public accommodations, non-discrimination protections. We had over 350 faith congregations and leaders say we support trans identities. And that's a huge shift. Oftentimes the opposition to transgender rights and the opposition to LGBTQ rights broadly thinks they have a monopoly on the faith-based communities, when in fact we had those 350 churches and communities.
That's actually kind of a little bit of a surprise.
It is,
when
right?
I think about church communities and the position that many faith communities often take. What do you think helped to move that particular group to be on the supporting side?
I think it varies from congregation to congregation, but I think the realization that there are already trans people in our congregations. There are trans people in churches, in synagogues, in mosques all across this state and all across the country. And to say that I don't see you as an equal congregation member or an equal person in this space definitely acts in contradiction to much of the religious doctrine out there. Of we all come to this space, we all come to faith with our own journeys and our own stories and our own experiences, but we are all equals in that journey.
So what do you think the impact of marriage equality had on the conversation around trans?
I think it had some impact, but it's also getting back to that difference between sexual orientation and gender identity and the ways in which we talk about these things.
But I don't know that distinction is always so clear to everyone.
Correct, it's not. But I think that some of the arguments that we faced with marriage equality, and actually I would even go further back into sexual orientation non-discrimination protections.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
It's my mother probably calling to see how you're doing.
I'm doing well.
Okay.
Tell her I say hi.
Mom, he says, so he's okay.
So some of the conversations that were happening around marriage equality and sexual orientation non-discrimination also went to the sex-segregated spaces. Back in, it was the 80s and early 90s when we passed non-discrimination for sexual orientation here in Massachusetts, that argument went to locker rooms. And that allowing gay and lesbian individuals into locker room spaces was going to be a threat to public safety. And so we saw that argument, we overcame that argument, And when it came now to trans rights, we had a similar mentality of expressing that we as trans people are no threat in any of these public spaces, including locker rooms and bathrooms, just like gay and lesbian and bisexual individuals were not threats in the same argument 20 years ago.
So, Mason, you were successful in moving the piece of legislation last year,
Yes.
but something has now happened.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the opposition to trans rights has been successful in collecting enough signatures to now put this law on the ballot in 2018.
Could you explain to us what that means?
Yeah, so what that means is that when a law passes here in Massachusetts, opponents to that law have about a 90-day window to collect enough signatures, a very, very small number of signatures, I might add. It's less than 1% of the voting population, to sign on and say, we think that this should go to a referendum. And that will then kick that law. The law will still be in effect, but it will kick it into a ballot question in the next election. And so the voting public has the opportunity, with enough of those signatures, to then vote on whether or not this law that has passed shall remain law. And that's
So
what happened
we
here.
now have, coming up in November,
Next November,
next
2018.
2018, an opportunity to repeal the legislation that was passed last year.
I'd rephrase that a little bit and say you have the opportunity to support trans rights in the ballot box. So it's that lobbying mind.
Yeah,
gotta,
gotcha.
Got to put
Okay.
it in the positive.
Yeah.
And so, yes, that is exactly what will be happening.
Right. And what's your sense about where the state is as you think in preparing for that ballot initiative?
You know, I think that Massachusetts is a state that has long prioritized civil rights and has a commonwealth that supports the rights of all people. And I think that that will carry through into this particular question. And on top of that, we know that recent polls show that residents of the Commonwealth support trans rights and will support this at the ballot. But we have a lot of education to do, and that's what we're really going to focus on in the next year, is to really educate about who are trans people. There was an article I would say about a year ago, that said that more people in the United States have seen a ghost than know somebody who's trans. So, about that, I think that really goes to show the amount of education that we need to do and the conversations that we need to have. And when I say conversations we need to have, it's not just me standing on a stage or sitting on a stage and talking about this. It's about each of you having a conversation about why are trans rights important to you, and talking with your networks, talking with your colleagues, with your friends, with your families, with your faith communities, with your neighbors about, hey, trans rights are really important to me, and I think it makes our state better and makes our state great. And to have those conversations, because I'm one person, and I cannot have that conversation with every voting member of this Commonwealth. So I rely on my friends, my allies, and our networks to have those conversations and be out there to say, this is important to us, and we will support this, and we will support trans people in our communities.
So the interesting thing that's been in the newspaper today is about what happened on Survivor yesterday.
Yes.
And I don't know that everyone really, I actually don't watch Survivor. So, and I know it's been on for a long time.
Neither do I, don't tell
Okay,
anyone.
you know, so we should tell them that
Yeah.
we had a conversation earlier about trash TV.
Yes.
And you and I do have some trash TV. We won't share with the rest of them what we think.
I'm an open book. I watch trashy TV, and I'm okay with it.
Okay,
but,
what's your favorite trash TV thing?
I like the bushcraft and the survival shows.
And I watch RuPaul's Drag Race.
Which is also a great one,
there
yeah.
you go.
So what happened last night on this episode of Survivor, for those who didn't know about this, there was a member of one of the Survivor teams who was outed as trans. It was against his will. He didn't want people to necessarily know that he was trans, but somebody else on the opposing team, I believe, found out that he was trans and outed him to the entire crew as well as the viewing public. And so it's fascinating that, and I still haven't, I need to watch the episode. I don't watch Survivor, but I need to watch this episode because, you know, the show had a very positive reaction of, we're not going to kick anybody out for being trans. We accept all identities in this space, but we are going to say that outing somebody against their will is contrary to what this show stands for, and kicked off the person who outed the trans person. Right. So it really shows a major journey.
That's a very different place than where we've been, isn't it?
It is. So I've been doing trans advocacy and education for 13 years now, which feels like a really long time. It's not nearly as long as some others in the community, but where we were when I started these conversations 13 years ago is light years away from where we are right now.
Yeah.
And the visibility for trans identities, the understanding that trans people are members of our communities is very different than where we were 10, 20, 30 years ago. And this show and the way that Survivor handled this is a great piece of evidence about that.
As I think about that and think about the challenge that we will have as we look at this piece of this ballot initiative that's coming forward, this is maybe a positive piece in thinking about what some individuals think about the population. May make it easier, but ballot initiatives are very expensive.
Yes, they are.
They take a really long time. They take a lot of energy. They suck away attention that you need to be giving to something else.
Right.
But it's still something that we'll need to think about as we go to not this year, but the next year.
Right. Exactly, and it's something to, again, it's back to that education piece of we just need to, it's easier to vote for something if you know somebody who's personally impacted or you've had a conversation with somebody who's personally impacted. And that's our job now, is to say, you know, this personally impacts me, or this is important to me, trans rights are important to me because my coworker is trans, or my friend is trans, or you know what, I think all people deserve equal space, equal rights and equal spaces, regardless of gender identity or gender expression. So.
Mason, I want to give the people in the audience an opportunity to join this conversation as well. And I'm wondering if there are thoughts, expressions that you have that you'd like to ask or share with us.
Or vote me off the island.
Yeah. Okay. There's no voting. I actually.
Oh, good. All right. Excellent.
Let's see what folks are thinking.
I think it's live.
Hi,
Yeah.
I'm not going to stand up. My name is Allison Boffman.
You have to stand up, Allison. Okay, there you go.
Right, Dean Cox. So my name is Allison Boffman, and I work here in the Health Policy, Law, and Management Department. And I almost forgot my question. Oh, so my question, I have many questions, and I listened to you at the Harvard School of Public Health last year, and it was one of the best talks I've ever heard at the Harvard School of Public Health, so kudos to you.
Thank you.
And I told people about you here, so hopefully I'm a little bit responsible for you being here today.
Thank you.
Anyway, my question is, are there steps in terms of advocacy or education that you're doing with the mainstream media and journalists? Because I think, unfortunately, you know, for trans rights issues, this bathroom bill language persists, and it doesn't need to persist. And I would encourage all of us not to use that language, because if you are, then you're reinforcing that kind of perception of what these bills are really about, which is non-discrimination. And unfortunately, you know, people with a certain world perspective and perspective about trans rights have been successful in framing these bills about bathrooms, which you clearly said they're not. But are you doing anything specifically around education of journalists and media? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, and thinking about the longer journey of getting media outlets to support trans rights, you know, we, here in Boston, the Boston Globe has been, I cannot speak more highly of them in the last couple of years of the way they've supported us. They editorialized in support of the trans rights legislation, not once, not twice, not 3 times, 4 times they editorialized in support of trans rights in the State House. And that's huge. And they did it in a way of raising, this isn't about bathrooms, this is about human rights. They talked about the importance of bipartisan support, which is what we had. The legislation that we passed last year passed with a supermajority in both the House and Senate, which is just an overwhelming amount of support from both sides of the aisle. And so I think that we've done some of that education, but it is definitely a continuing conversation that we need to have outside of Boston, and thinking of some of the smaller newspapers and media outlets that we need to get to have these conversations. And really what that's about is bringing trans people to the table and say, here's my story that I want to tell you. And it goes back to that point I made earlier of it is so much harder to discriminate against somebody and to use negative language or to vote against somebody's rights when you can recall sitting across the table from them and listening to their stories and listening to the raw emotions, the challenges, and the triumphs that this community has faced and these individuals have faced. And so I think that is what we will continue to do, is to bring our stories as trans people to the table and say this is who we are and we deserve respectful coverage just like anyone else.
Thank you.
Great question.
Professor Sates.
Thank you.
You have to stand up too.
I have to stand up, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. What are the primary major health issues that you see affecting the trans community, and do they include interpersonal violence, mental health issues, and what are the ways that we should be advocating addressing those?
That is a great question. And there are so many health challenges that trans folks do face when it comes to partner and family abuse, when it comes to experiences of oppression and the ways in which society oppresses trans identities, as well as so many other marginalized identities, including race and immigration status and class and things like that, and the way that has a larger impact on our health. Thinking about issues of depression, anxiety, suicide ideation, as well as substance abuse that we see in the trans community. All of the oppression and marginalization, unfortunately, has a greater impact on those issues of mental health and wellness. I think one of the other issues to talk about and raise up is simply a matter of cultural competency within healthcare. Of finding healthcare providers. Here in Boston, it's one thing. We have some wonderful, inclusive healthcare providers doing amazing work, including Boston Medical and so many others that we're very lucky. But as soon as you get outside the Boston metro area and you get into western and central Massachusetts, you get into the South Shore, there are fewer trans-inclusive, trans-competent healthcare providers, which forces trans people to either see somebody who doesn't understand them or to travel great distances and at great expense into Boston. I was doing this work, trans advocacy work up in New Hampshire before I came down here to Massachusetts. And the number of people who come down from not just New Hampshire thinking Manchester, Concord, but north of the Notch, who drive down into Boston, sometimes 3+ hours one way to access inclusive healthcare, it's absurd. There's no reason that you should have to travel that kind of distance to access a doctor who will see you, who will understand, and who will treat you in a way that is inclusive. And so I think simple access is a major area that our communities can work on together in terms of hosting conversations like this around trans inclusion.
Or when you were just here in a building just within the last month or so talking to medical students.
And that is one thing I try and do, is get into the education of future healthcare providers so that they are going out into the workforce with this knowledge already, as well as getting into hospital systems, getting into healthcare providers' offices, and providing opportunities for education. And spreading that information is one thing that you all can do, and we can talk about trainings, we can talk about resources, we can talk about all of these things that hopefully myself and the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition can provide to make sure that no trans person has to travel 2-3 hours just to access a doctor who knows who they are and understands who they are.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, wait, I think.
Hi, how's it going? Oh, sorry. Aldina, I work in the Department of Community Health Sciences, and I'm an MPH student here.
Great.
So I wanted to ask about one thing that I've seen a lot in the news lately is how the criminal justice system deals with trans folks. So I was wondering if, just like in terms of solitary confinement and how they're disproportionately put in solitary confinement and arrested disproportionately and on levels unlike any other, population. So I was wondering, could you speak to any reform efforts that are happening either on a state level or federal level, and is it for this population specifically or more inclusive of other ones?
So one word about capacity a little bit. So the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition, we are a staff of 1.5. So unfortunately, we cannot take on every issue. And there's so many issues that we do take on around healthcare, around non-discrimination legislation, policy, education, community empowerment that we take on. Unfortunately, criminal justice reform is a very, very large effort that we don't have the capacity to work on as an individual organization, but there are organizations who are doing fantastic work that I want to raise up. The first is Black and Pink. They're a fantastic organization working on the rights of LGBTQ folks who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. And they really work hard on criminal justice reform, as well as the well-known organization GLAAD, the GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders, who have worked on criminal justice legislation as well as litigation when it comes to trans rights and trans protections. We know that the criminal justice system disproportionately impacts particularly trans people of color, and disproportionately not only in the arrests, but also in the treatment and the negative treatment of trans people of color in our prison systems. And that is a concern that I have, that many people in this community have, and that the organizations Black and Pink and GLAAD are actively working on to reform. So.
Thank you.
Mason.
I'm sorry, everyone else had to stand.
I will stand as well.
Yeah, you too. Okay.
It's a terrific conversation.
Don't hold that
Thank
against me.
Not today.
Well,
So our interests as a school are very much aligned with yours. Now, but you're an advocate, and so you operate in a certain way, and we operate in a different way.
Yeah.
Help us see how we, as a university, we're a university, we generate research, scholarship, we teach our students, and we do as well, and we do some advocacy, but we're some constrained by sort of a variety of things. So what can we do that can be most useful towards the same ends? I think we have very similar ends. We see public health as, ultimately, the health of the public is limited unless it's an inclusive world of everybody, regardless of gender identity or any other stripe. So what can we do to be most useful to you?
Yeah, I have many thoughts. I'm gonna go to a really nerdy place that I like to talk about when it comes to policy and academia, which is around data. We simply don't have enough data and studies that understand gender identity. And so as an academic institution that is doing so much amazing research and providing really complex, important data, think about ways that you can collect data that relates to gender identity, as well as sexual orientation, as well as other marginalized identities that have an impact on health. And so when you are collecting health data as it pertains to something that may not be LGBT specific, like substance abuse, like partner abuse, like access to healthcare providers in rural areas, whatever it may be that you are studying and providing data on that can help us in advocacy, make sure to include a question in there or include just a small analysis of the intersection of gender identity and sexual orientation. And that can be, that's going to move mountains. Because we just don't have information. I get questions every day of how many trans people are in Massachusetts? I don't know, we don't collect that data. How many trans people are disproportionately impacted by partner abuse? We really don't have good data that we can rely on to say, this is an issue. We know it's an issue anecdotally. We know that some studies have shown this to be a major concern across the US, but especially Massachusetts-specific data, we just don't have. And so that's one area that I get really nerdy about is the data, because we need it and to answer particularly policy questions. Because unless you can say, this is the number of people disproportionately impacted like this, then you're not going to be as heard or seen in particular policy arenas. Beyond that, I think driving conversations like this and continuing these conversations, not just in these spaces that's trans-specific, but trans identity should be a part of the curriculum for all areas of academic study. And it doesn't have to be a one-class thing. Today we're going to talk about endocrinology as it relates to trans people. It should just be a part of the conversation just as any other element in the conversations we have in our curriculum. Including trans identities in your curriculum is essential. And it doesn't just need to be a one-off, today we're talking about this, it needs to be included broadly. So I think those are two areas, but I think they can branch out into larger issues of education and awareness that you are fostering with students as well as faculty and staff. Thank you.
Mason, North Carolina has been in the news a whole lot.
Yes, it has.
And they've just recently changed, they've just recently voted to repeal, except they didn't really change anything.
No, they didn't.
Could you tell us what they didn't do?
So the background on this House Bill 2 that many people know of, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. House Bill 2 passed a few years ago in North Carolina. That was a blatant attempt at discrimination against LGBTQ people in the state of North Carolina. And the community and larger LGBTQ national groups have been working on a repeal of House Bill 2 ever since it passed. And what was eventually passed a few weeks ago is a very, very watered down attempt at a repeal that simply says that you can eventually pass non-discrimination protections for gender identity and sexual orientation, but not till 2020. And we're not really going to touch the issue of the bathrooms. We're not going to change any of that. We're just going to push this down and call it a repeal. And
so in effect, they didn't really change anything. They gave them permission to change something, but way into the future.
Exactly. And so the real life implication for trans people in North Carolina is they are going to face the same amount of discrimination at the hands of the state as before when House Bill 2 was enacted and now with this repeal. Nothing really changes, unfortunately.
So in our last couple of minutes of this conversation, I want you to answer two questions.
Okay.
Well, one is, if, as individuals who are interested in understanding the population of people who are trans, what is the thing that you would encourage us to think about and to do as we are gaining in our own sensitivity, in our own knowledge? What is it that you would want us to do as we think about understanding and advocating on behalf of the trans population? That's question one.
Okay, and I'm going to do a two-part answer to question one, but I'll try and keep it brief as much as a lawyer can. So
we have a few lawyers that work here. We got it. We
and I make a joke about brief and lawyers.
Right.
I have a really bad sense of humor. But the 2 points that I would say are get involved. Whatever it is that relates either to trans identities, but also thinking about all of the intersecting identities around race and economic disparities and class and immigration, get involved with that dialogue and that conversation. Going to rallies, volunteering with organizations, whatever it is that you have the capacity to do it. Take that action, take that step, and be involved. And then the other point on that I will say is, don't stop. Don't stop learning, don't stop being involved, don't stop, because as soon as you stop, your allyship stops. You have to continuously educate and re-educate yourself in order to be an ally. And so you cannot ever say, I just know everything there is to know, and I volunteered a year ago, and I'm done. That's not allyship. That is something that I don't even know what you would call that. But to get involved, stay involved, get informed, and stay informed are the crucial ways. And that will look very different depending on your time, your capacity, your involvement, where you are in the state. But whatever it is, find something and continue to learn and grow in that area.
The second question is talking to an individual who is trans. Mm-hmm. And you are an incredible role model for a lot of people. That may scare you.
It very much scares me.
But you are. And the fact that you are able to speak out the way that you are, and your ability to be able to tell your own story, and then to be able to support others. But I suspect that there are some people who are still struggling, who are still thinking about, is this the right thing for me? How can I go through which may be a very complicated journey? Right. What would you say to those individuals?
You know, I think authenticity for all of us is a struggle. Being our authentic, true selves, whether it relates to our gender identity, our sexual orientation, our career path, our morals, our faith, our family, authenticity is always a struggle. But the reward of living your authentic self is indescribable. And so I would say to them, never stop looking for your authenticity. And if you're struggling around gender identity, that's okay. Authenticity is never going to be easy. But there are community members there who have been through that journey, who can understand, who can relate, and we are there to support you, to help you through this struggle. You don't have to do it alone. But the reward of finding that authentic self is truly worth it. You just have to reach out for support, and we are there.
I really appreciate you being here today.
I appreciate being here as well, and thank you so much for bringing me. This was fantastic.
Please thank our guests.
Thank you.